Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our special guest today is Russ Poulin, Executive Director for WCET, the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education's Center for Education Technology. Russ has a long history in distance and online education, having coordinated distance education activities for the North Dakota University system before joining WCET, and he represented the distance education community in the Department of Education's 2014 and 2019 negotiated rulemaking process. Russ joined us to discuss the recent implementation of the new distance education rules and what we can expect out of Washington in the next few months. Russ, welcome back to the show.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's great to have you back. And so many things have changed in the last 6 to 9 months since you were on the show. NegReg 19 has been fully published. New guidance for online COVID. Frankly, I don't know where to start.
Well, that's a really good question, because over the summer we had a period where it seemed like things were changing by the day, if not the week, and we even had some things where we were publishing that we had to pull back as we were publishing them. So,
and talking with clients, they would have a morning meeting for what they're going to get done for the day and moving forward. And 15 minutes after they start, it had all changed. Right.
Well, it's great to have fun times here with us, isn't it?
Yes. I can remember saying from the Navy, flexibility is the key to success, and indecision is the key to flexibility. and so that, I think that sums up the COVID era really well.
Well, people have said, I remember my early career, people said, well, you have an unusual tolerance for inexactitude. And so it served me well. So,
especially in times like this.
Right.
So let's start off with NegReg. All the guidance has been published. It started off with consensus across the board on all areas, which was amazing. We talked about that the last time you were on the show. The latest one to be published and the last one was really the guidance for online.
Yeah.
And some of the things with that. What are some of the highlights with that you think university presidents should know?
Well, I think they should really be looking at the distance education definition that came out this summer. That's a really interesting one, and that will officially go into effect in July of 2021, or the institutions can decide that they want to implement it early. But they'll really want to look at that to make sure that their courses fit to be whether distance ed or correspondence ed, because what happens is if they have too many correspondence courses where there's not enough regular and substantive interaction, their federal financial aid could be at risk. So presidents may want to have somebody paying attention to that, making sure that with the new definition of the buckets that they fit into the right bucket.
So what is the difference then, the difference now between distance education and correspondence? Well,
the problem was for years was that there was not a really very clear definition at all, and yet my colleague Van Davis and I were following this, and about the only way that you could figure it out was that we were following what rulings were against institutions. Well, that's not a really good way for institutions to comply, because they typically don't follow the rulings against institutions. And so we were trying to follow that for them. But now, the big difference is that there are actual definitions for this term, regular substantive interaction, where they have some definitions that you can go by. They have to be general enough definitions to fit, remember, 4,000 to 6,000 different types of institutions. So people wanted very specific things, but if you do something specific, it'll fit for these institutions, but not for those. And so we have to remember that. So, but at least it's down the path of at least having criteria on which to guide their actions.
So Russ, tell me the difference between what used to be considered substantive interaction, and now what the guidance says from the Department of Education?
Yes, yeah, and that's a really good question, because before, substantive was just around content, and it was that the content had to be relevant to the subject. So if the content of the interaction, and so if you're talking about Shakespeare, that you should be talking about Shakespeare in the interaction and not what happened in the basketball game. And now they've changed it to beyond content to several different types of activities, like that you're providing instruction, that you're providing feedback as part of the instruction, that you're providing assessments on the instruction. And so we moved it from a content-based to an activity-based definition.
Okay. Well, that makes perfect sense. And that also allows for different types of instruction as well, instead of just what we typically thought of online, but from a competency-based education model, correct?
Yes, yeah, and that's really something where part of the regular part of the definition starts to put into some of the aspects that you see in competency-based education, because it has, within that definition, it has both the expectation that there be a regular and predictable type of interaction, so that you're going to follow up with the student on you decide weekly or biweekly, whatever it is, basis, or 3 times a week. But also that in what you see in competency-based education, the ability for the faculty person to really be following the student and what they're doing, and then interact with them and help the student when they need it, rather than just doing it on a set schedule as you do in the standard classroom.
That makes it interesting, because as I understand the guidance from the department, they're saying a minimum of once a week.
Yeah, that was one of the things that we couldn't put in the regulation, the once a week thing, because what happens is that if you have a 4-week or 6-week course, then once a week is not enough. And we tried a formula and all these sorts of things. But I think what they said with the once a week was that for the standard 15-week sort of course, 10-week course in a quarter, that what they were thinking of was about once a week, but that it should be adjusted if you have a shorter course. But they didn't want to put it in the regulation because they wanted to be flexible enough. Right?
Of course. And with something like CBE, you may not need as much interaction as you would if someone was teaching a class via Zoom or more prescribed methods, which is typically what you see with online education.
Yeah, and that's one of the things where the way the language ended up on the regular part was that they left it so that they still want the regular interaction, even if it's a CBE course. And that may cause some problems for CBE institutions to try to figure out how to do that, because competency-based education is usually the interaction is from the student, and for this regulation, at least at this time, that there's still some expectation that the faculty reach out to the student, at least on a regular and predictable basis.
Which makes perfect sense. Why do you even need faculty if they're not interacting with students? Of course, I know a lot of institutions like to do away with faculty completely, but that's not realistic.
Let's not be doing that. That's probably not a good idea. But we do want, it is the start of opening it up for some of the more computer-assisted adaptive learning, these sorts of things to start to be recognized as something that is an aid in terms of signaling when interaction should occur.
Well, it sounds like what you folks, and you were part of the NegReg group, it sounds like you were not only looking at what's going on, but what potentially might be happening in the future. And that's the way a good group comes together and looks at things.
Yes, yeah, and it's really, that is one of the things that's really hard in writing regulations, is trying to make it so that they're future-proofed, and it's pretty impossible. And we have to remember the last time that this regular and substantive interaction was really changed in any substantial way was back in 1992. So a few things have happened since then. So it's
really?
going to be, yeah, there have been changes around the edges, but if we're going to go another 27 years or 28 years before we change it, we better put something in that thinks about the future a little bit.
Well, we're getting close to that with the redoing of the Higher Education Act, but we won't go into that just yet.
Please. No predictions on that.
Absolutely. And of course, all of this stuff got thrown out the window with COVID. all of the regulations on higher ed, distance education, because everybody swapped over in spring term. Some of them did it within 3 days. The majority were around 2 weeks, but they converted all their face-to-face to online.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of forgiveness, both from the federal, from the accreditors, and from some, not all, of the states in terms of these rules. It's important to know that not every rule was there waivers on. And so it's really important for institutions as they move into the fall and into the spring to understand that things like the accessibility rules, that while there was some wavering going back and forth on exactly what the Department of Ed meant, that there's still the expectation that you serve the accessibility needs of students. And that's an example of one that really has not been waived, and that there are others where, as you have more and more courses that are digitized, that are in some sort of online or blended or high flex format, that you need to know which rules are in place and which ones are not.
And one of the things, that we all know that the Department of Ed set aside a number of the regulations for spring term. They extended that to the end of December or the end of the crisis, whichever comes later. Not first, but later.
Right.
But with that, there's some serious challenges. I mean, folks, they converted over. They're not thinking about assessment with that. And all of a sudden, you're going to find yourself with a gap of a year to maybe even a year and a half of assessment data. That's going to be huge.
Yeah, I think so. And it's going to be important to try to figure out what it is you're assessing, what type of courses it was in, what the formats were, because this is a huge issue with this idea versus the planned online course versus what been called emergency remote learning. So, and I always use if you're on a cruise ship and get thrown into a lifeboat, that you're going to have different meals on each one. And so, we've had some people who said, "Oh, well, look at the remote learning wasn't working." Well, here you threw faculty who had no training in doing this, and you had students who didn't sign up for this into this lifeboat. And we need to make sure when we're doing the evaluation and looking at those assessments that we make sure that we are comparing apples and apples.
Very much so. It's very challenging. And, as one of my guests, Gordon Gee, who's the president of West Virginia, has said, COVID is accelerating the needed changes in higher ed by a decade or more. But there are still the need for assessment. And if you just convert the courses over, you don't necessarily convert everything to make good assessment. And I'm focusing in on assessment, but frankly, it's way beyond that. It's, how do you make a course that's really good for students, that students get the learning rather than just these emergency conversions that you spoke of?
Yeah, and there's so many issues around assessment, in that there were institutions that ended up spending lots of money on proctoring because they had to expand proctoring to, let's say it was 15% or 25% of the courses to 100%, then they had to pick up the cost for that. But then it raised some really good pedagogical questions, as you are, in that, it's really high stakes tests, really the best type of academic assessment we should be using, and that actually there's concerns about cheating, students cheating or student identity, and that if you use different types of assessment and more assessments that are more frequent and more interactive with the students, that you actually have better demonstration of learning and cut down on the ability of students to cheat.
It makes perfect sense. And, with all these things, the courses have to be something that the students learn from rather than just kind of a throw out there. If you're going to take advantage of COVID, and we say at my business all the time, don't let a good crisis go to waste.
Right.
You've got to be able to convert the courses over to where you can run these as online courses. And that's, making a course from a faculty's perspective, having a course that's face-to-face is building it as one thing, doing something online to me, takes far more thought than it does a face-to-face course. Because, face-to-face, you have your lectures, you have your assessments, your tests, interactions. You've got to put all of that stuff down online so that you thought about it all. I mean, to me, it's 2 or 3 times the amount of work.
Yeah, it quite often is, and really can be. You have to think this all through, and that it starts bringing other sorts of things in terms of videos or simulations or other things that you could do that could be more effective, where you can actually get across your points by working harder in getting a video. You can get your point across in 10 minutes that would take you an hour or 2 worth of lecture. We've just seen that time and again with good video, audio, but that takes a lot of work in order to think that out and script it and film it to make it work if you're going to go that way. But you're right, and then you have to be prepared for any technical problems as well.
Yes, and of course we all have heard about Zoom bombing.
Yeah, let's not be doing any of that.
Yeah, let's not. Oh, here comes one now. No, I'm just kidding. So one of the things that, I really appreciate for what you guys are doing at WCET is you put together a policy playbook to help institutions and practitioners convert courses to online or whatever the modality is. Tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
Yes, yeah, this was a really great effort that came out of one of our initiatives is Every Learner Everywhere, which is a network of 12 organizations. This was put together by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and that they funded us to create this playbook. And the idea is that as you move these courses over from where you're using very little types of online or digitized content or anything like that, and you move it over to online, hybrid, blended, what have you, high flex type of course, that the rules change. And we put it as, it's as if you entered a different state, and that there's different rules in that other state. Well, you need to be aware of what the rules are in that different state and where you go to. So just an example of one, if you take your content and put it online, that the fair use rules end up being different in a digital context than they do in a face-to-face. And so that's just an example of one of the things that you need to be aware of.
I've seen the playbook. You guys did a fabulous job with it. And for listeners, we'll put in the show notes, we'll put a link to the playbook so that folks can take a look at it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we covered quite a number of things that we think will be helpful for those, and it is quite a number of things. But just take your time and go through and find the ones that you think you need to work on. So,
we all do certain things well, and there's certain
right. things
that we can improve on.
And in that book, there is a really important addenda that's written by our friend Karen Solomon from Higher Learning Commission, one of the accrediting agencies, about, we kind of put it that the time for forgiveness is going to be over pretty soon. And this goes back to your waivers sorts of things. And the accreditors are saying, okay, we could waive things for a while, but we can't, for student protection and quality reasons, we can't waive things forever. And we're into this transition now this fall in terms of the accreditors are going to start asking some really hard questions about what we're doing, and we better be prepared with answers.
I would prognosticate, which I am prone to do from time to time, I would say that beginning in fall term in 2021, things are going to have to be back to normal from a course delivery, from an assessment perspective. And it doesn't matter whether you're doing face-to-face,
right,
online, converted online, whatever. You're going to have to be checking all the boxes by then.
Yeah, and the accreditors may expect it before that. So it'll be good to follow and start talking to your accreditors now.
Well, just tell your accreditors that Drum said, and it shouldn't be an issue.
That's right.
So we're coming up toward the end of the time. I did want to get a little bit into the politics. I think most folks have heard we've got an election coming up in the next month.
So I've heard.
And it could have some major implications on higher ed. What are you seeing? We talked a little before that the Trump administration has pushed through major changes to higher education, and not sure how many more of those have to have to be pushed through, from a public perspective, now maybe from a private or an alternative education. Yeah, there could be some more there. But what are you seeing the differences between a potential second Trump term or a Biden term?
Yeah, and I think that in not surprising, there'll be major differences. And I think if the Trump administration continues, that I'm not sure that they have a huge plans for traditional higher education. But I do think that they're very interested in the career focus, career education sorts of things, and also perhaps expanding out aid, federal financial aid beyond the traditional institutions to those sorts of providers who provide short-term sorts of paths to getting careers. And so that could be a whole different focus in the second term. The Biden administration comes in, I think that we'll see probably some undoing of several of the things that we saw in the Trump administration. Certainly some things around Title IX could go away. I think that there was some unhappiness with some of the regulations that you said came out of the negotiated rulemaking, that this distance ed definition we talked about before might never go into place, that could happen. But I could see a very consumer protection focus to a Biden administration.
I wish we could say more on that, but we've got at least a month, and so to be determined.
To be determined, yes. Yeah.
Which is probably good because our listeners here are, on all sides of the political spectrum, and whereas we don't want to offend anyone, these are what we kind of think are the facts going forward.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing now, at least. Who knows? There could be a lot more coming, and then things change, once you get the administrations in place. So.
Yeah, and if we actually have an election, but
yeah.
We probably shouldn't go there.
No.
And so, just wrapping up, Russ, what do you think of the big three that university presidents need to be thinking about going forward with the negotiated rulemaking, toll on faculty administration? What are the things that they should be thinking about at this point when it comes to distance education?
Well, I think so. Change in terms of these regulations, unfortunately, that we keep thinking that it would be nice to have some stability, but we've talked about some of these. One would be that when you move from face-to-face courses into a digital distance, remote learning sort of focus, that there is a change there, and the presidents better make sure that somebody's paying attention to compliance, because while there's some forgiveness now, it won't go on forever. The second is that if there's a change in administrations, some of these rules that are going into place, like the distance ed definition, could get changed quite a bit. It probably won't happen right away, but you can imagine that happening in a new Biden administration fairly soon, plus others. So be prepared for just as fast as some of the things changed under Trump administration, we could see that as well. The other thing that I'd like to say to the presidents is, to really honor the heroes on your campus, because really my colleagues in the distance ed, the instructional designer folks, the faculty and all this, they really came to the fore in what they did in terms of getting the campuses rolling and going in the spring. They've been running a sprint, and they figured out they're in a marathon now. And so, please be kind to these people because they've kept the institution afloat. And it's just amazing. I do call them heroes because I see the people and what they're doing in terms of making all this work in uncertain times is really quite amazing.
It really is. In fact, one of our recent guests, Tom Mars, who's with Texas A&M, their executive education, talked to this very thing, creating resiliency in your team, because folks, you normally expect folks to have some sort of summer vacation. There wasn't any this year. They were still running that sprint, and fall classes come, they're burned out. They're exhausted.
Yeah. People who I respect very, very much, and I didn't think I would see get burnt out or getting burnt out, and so that worries me. And so I hope the presidents are. I'm sure that they are paying attention to that.
No doubt. And so, what's next for you, Russ, or WCET? What do you see the future being?
Well, there's certainly a lot going on in terms of how do we act on the distance ed and moving forward. And then one of the things that we're really focusing on is that something that COVID has really shown is that this has had an inequitable impact on certain populations. And we're doing a review of the research on this. We're finding very little research on it. And so we're going to challenge our community to figure out what research should we be doing, but not only research, but we want to do the research because we want to then have that lead to activities, but we want to make sure we're doing the right activities. And we want to make sure that we're doing the right things for people who are either people of color, people in rural areas, what have you, in terms of making sure that if we have to do more digitized education, that we figure out how we can do it and serve everybody well.
It makes perfect sense. It's so much needed. I've always wondered why folks haven't used spare bandwidth on a television, a cable station, satellite to do classes that way. Maybe that'll be one of the things that'll happen going forward. Who knows?
Yeah, and that was a big thing for a while. I remember those days that you had some local areas, but I think people are being creative and trying to figure out how to serve those populations.
When do you expect that study to be out?
Well, I'm hoping sometime in early to mid-October that we should have that together. I'm having a meeting just this week, and so it'll be the first part of a look at a review of that literature.
Well, once you've got the full study done, let's have you back and talk about it.
Yes, yeah, and I would recommend something that Every Learner Everywhere is the organization, and that they sponsored a study that was a survey of faculty and students in the spring. And just quickly, one of the findings was that faculty were more interested in moving forward with digital learning than we thought they might be. We were worried that they'd get thrown into it and they would hate it. And so there was some of that, but not as much as we thought.
If you want to change, have a crisis, make people change.
That's right. Right.
Well, great. Well, Russ, it's been great having you on the show again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Russ Poulin, the Executive Director at WCET, and for his sharing his thoughts on how the latest policies coming out of Washington will affect distance education going forward. Our next guest is Jerry Zernecki, Chairman and CEO of the National Leadership Institute and principal stockholder of the Deltinium Group. Jerry recently stepped down from being chair of the Board of Trustees of the National University System, and he'll be talking with us about mergers and acquisitions as growth strategies and giving us some insight on how those acquisitions at National University went.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.